Welcome back to Counting the Cost, your weekly business stop here on Al Jazeera. I'm Kamal Santa Maria. Continuing our look at ethical investments, the right way to do business, or in this next case perhaps, the right way not to do business. The European Union is threatening to revoke valuable trade concessions with Sri Lanka on account of labour and human rights abuses in the country. The end result? Thousands of jobs in Sri Lanka's textile industry could be under threat. But is the EU, in the long run at least, doing the right thing? FERNANDEZ reports from Sri Lanka.
Arriving for the morning shift, SUBASHINI is one of tens of thousands of people employed in Sri Lanka's garment industry.
I've been doing this job for 6 years and it's very important to me. I maintain my family and it's due to this job that I've been standing on my own feet.
As Sri Lanka emerges from its 26-year civil war, the path to peace is proving difficult. With over 250,000 people displaced by the fighting, still living in camps in the north, the European Union says the government isn't doing enough to meet its international obligations on human rights. It's threatening to remove the special privileges given to Sri Lankan-made textiles that enter its 27 member countries. The irony is that Sri Lanka has made a name for itself in clothing by respecting workers' rights and showing its commitment to the environment. Factories such as this one operate to standards laid down by some of the developed world's biggest retailers and have helped turn the textile industry into Sri Lanka's second biggest source of foreign exchange. Manufacturers have worked hard to establish and maintain quality and good working practices. They operate a program called Garments Without Guilt, with independent international auditors and certification systems to prove members are free of forced labor, child workers and sweatshop conditions. Though a costly exercise, the move has paid off, bringing in top international brands which value ethical manufacturing. The European Union says the government needs to do more.
One on the rights of the child, there were a number of questions raised about certain militias who were continued to recruit child soldiers. There were questions on labour rights, and most importantly, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. That one in particular is where a lot of the focus has been.
Although the Sri Lankan government says it has no case to answer, there's been a flurry of diplomacy between Colombo and Brussels.
Because there's greater respect and greater value that we place on people's rights, their human rights, their protection, their security, their liberty. Now, therefore, we have to get away from the myth that one is carrying for the last 1.5 years. There's a serious violation of human rights in Sri Lanka.
The outcome is crucial to an industry which provides jobs for as many as 1 million people, directly and indirectly. Manufacturers had already been feeling the pressure from lower demand as a result of the global recession. The loss of European concessions may force some factories out of business.
If that goes away, I think what would happen is we will not destroy everything we've built, but you will find people who can't compete. You will find businesses that will close down for sure. There will be a strain.
A final decision is due by mid-December. Workers like SUBASHINI will be hoping for good news. Their jobs may depend on it. FERNANDEZ, Al Jazeera, Colombo.
And finally to Russia, where one investment fund is trying to take on the Russian state and expose what it claims is corruption on multiple levels. The story goes like this. Hermitage Capital Management, a big investor in Russia, claims 3 of its companies were seized to reclaim some $230 million in tax from the state. But it's those involved which makes it more interesting. Hermitage says there are judges, tax officials, lawyers and politicians all part of it. And then, earlier this month, Russia issued an international arrest warrant for Hermitage's CEO and founder, William Browder, claiming he illegally evaded taxes. Sama Al-Shahat spoke to William Browder and began by asking him how all of this happened.
It's a quite remarkable story. So I showed up in Russia to live and to start my business in 1996, to invest in the Russian market. And between 1996 and 2005, I became the largest investor in the country. And I did that by basically making investments in companies that weren't so good, doing detailed analysis into what they were doing wrong in the companies, and then naming and shaming the management of those companies.
So that was your business model, the naming and shaming aspect of these companies?
Well, you had to do it because there were so many things going wrong in the companies. The management were stealing assets, moving cash flow for their own accounts, and so on and so forth.
So they were kind of stealing it away from their shareholders. So you were really protecting the shareholders.
I was protecting the shareholders, and I was also protecting, in many cases, the government who owned a big piece of the companies. And remarkably, nobody was interested in doing this other than me. So I did it. And it was good for everybody. It was good for the shareholders because the share price went up. It was good for the government because they then got a share of more money that was in the companies. It was just generally good for Russia to see that such a model could work. The only people it wasn't good for were the guys who were stealing the money. And eventually, one day in November 2005, I was flying back to Russia, living there 10 years. They stopped me at the airport, November 13th, 2005, and they said, "You're no longer allowed in the country." They had me sit in the airport for 24 hours, and then they deported me back to the UK. I had $4 billion invested in their country at the time. Quite a remarkable thing to do for someone like that. So I would have thought that that was the end of my problems. That, okay, so I'm in London, not the end of the world. Then a year and a half later, the police, the Moscow police, raided our office in Moscow, and they raided the office of our law firm, and they took away all of the documents that made up our investment holding companies in Russia. And the next thing we knew, the investment holding companies didn't belong to us. The police, in conjunction with some criminals, had stolen our companies. And to make the craziest part of the story, after stealing our companies, they then went through a very complicated scheme to steal the taxes that we had paid two years before. They stole $230 million from themselves, essentially.
So they stole your companies, but also the tax that you gave the Russian taxpayer, the Russian people, in effect.
So 2 years before, we paid the tax, and they came up with a complicated scheme to claim that tax back, and it was rewarded back to them in 2 days by the Russian tax authorities, $230 million.
That's an incredible amount of money. I mean, surely people in Russia must be aware of your situation. So what are they doing about it?
Well, it's a remarkable story. We've written 35 criminal complaints to every different department of the Russian government saying, this is a travesty, you should do something about this is unbelievable, this is terrible, this is wrong. They did one thing about it, which is they went and tried to arrest all of my lawyers. We had 4 lawyers from 4 different law firms working on this. 3 of them were fortunate enough to get out of the country before they got arrested. One poor fellow, Sergei Magnitsky, is sitting in jail, 11 months sitting in jail. What was his crime? Testifying against the police officers about stealing the companies. He's been sitting in jail now. He hasn't been allowed any access to his family. He's lost 18 kilos. It's just the most, he'd been denied medical treatment when he needed it. It's just the most unbelievable, inhumane thing I've ever seen.
But I mean, how unbelievable really is your story, given that there are other cases that happened, such as yours? I mean, there is the case of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the head of UKOS. And during the time that you were doing so well, he was arrested in 2003. Yep. And many said he was arrested because he challenged, at the time, President Putin.
Well, basically, there's Khodorkovsky, there's my own story, and there's probably, if you were to add them up, there's probably 1,000 other stories just like it. I mean, this is not a isolated occurrence. And part of the reason that you don't hear about it that much is because most people are afraid to talk about it. And even within Russia, when we've tried to publicize our story, we haven't been able to get through because the televisions won't talk about it at all because the television is completely state-controlled. And the newspapers, to the extent that they could talk about it, they're scared to because they don't want to be arrested by the same police officers.
Let me come in here. You had used the newspapers in your business model, in your naming and shaming model. So who do you think is behind this? I mean, you must have some ideas.
Well, we know a lot of people that are behind it because there's a lot of people whose names are on documents that signed forms to seize the documents from our office, who signed the tax return forms that transferred the companies and so on and so forth. Those are all the low-level people, the mid-level people. But just think about it. What country in the world would give a $230 million tax rebate in 2 days without a pretty senior person signing off on it?
I mean, given that Russia is renowned for its incredible bureaucracy, to be able to give a tax rebate in 2 days, I mean, that's pretty incredible.
It's unheard of. I mean,
so how high does it go up?
Well, I can't point to any specific person because those people have done a good job of covering themselves, but you should assume that with such a large crime, there's a pretty big godfather sitting somewhere up there high.
Do you think that your experience in many ways would put off any other foreign investors from coming in and actually investing in Russia?
You really should think twice. It's one thing to buy stocks and sell them. You can buy them today, sell them tomorrow. But to go set up a bunch of warehouses or a factory where you're making a 10-year or 20-year commitment, I wouldn't do it based on what happened to me.
And where would that leave the Russian economy, per se? Because it's still very much so relying on oil.
Well, it's a disaster. I mean, think about it. If you're, what is an economy that doesn't rely on its natural resource? It's an economy that has small and medium-sized businesses. And who would want to start a small or medium-sized business if any day the police could come in and expropriate it for their own benefit? And that's the environment that you have in Russia today. And it's an impossible environment to promote entrepreneurship, and then which means it's an impossible environment for them to diversify. And it's a shame. It's a real shame.
And we did approach the Russian Interior Ministry for comment on this story, but our requests for an interview were turned down. And that is just about it for this week. Do let us know what you're thinking, though. Head to aljazeera.net/English. Click on Your Views on the left-hand side. You can leave your comments on any business-related discussion there. And of course, while you're there, you can check in on all the latest business news at aljazeera.net/English. That is it from Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.